Buenos días a todos. Bueno, como parte de las actividades de la quinta mesa de trabajo del Seminario Fonológica, organizamos un curso, mini curso, sobre fonología emergente y el doctor Douglas Pulley-Blanc de la Universidad de British Columbia nos va a guiar sobre esta propuesta de cómo emerge la fonología. El doctor Pulley-Blanc necesita, pues no necesita mucho, para todo el mundo lo conoce, es un fonólogo teórico, especialista, bueno, en lenguas africanas y en problemas que tocan directamente el núcleo de los principios teóricos de las fonologías o de la teoría fonológica. Pues no necesito decir más, sus obras las conocemos de sobra, y pues le doy la palabra al doctor Pulley-Blanc. Bienvenido al colegio.
Gracias. ¿Puede entenderme? Sí. So, sorry I have to do this in English. I would like this to be quite informal. There will be nothing worse than spending hours talking about things and having it completely incomprehensible. So if you have questions, please ask them. Anything, slow me down, something's not clear, whatever. So I would rather have this as an interaction. I have way more, I think, than we could possibly go through in 2 days. So my goal is not to complete this. My goal is to just have, time we can talk about these various things. So please ask questions. So what I want to do is basically lay out a model I've been working on with Diana Arcangeli, who's at the University of Arizona. And a lot of this comes from work with her. Some of it doesn't. If you find problems, that's probably my fault. So, there's the acknowledgement. But the leading idea Yeah, it was.
Nos dirigimos hacia...
So, I'm probably going to stand up, wander around. The important thing is to see this, not to see me. Okay, so make sure you can see the screen. So I put up here some of the things that we may talk about. A lot of the cases will involve interactions between morphology and phonology. The goal is to kind of lay out the basic properties of this framework we've been developing and then look at a certain number of issues to do with, say, selection of allomorphs, generation of allomorphs, and so on. But, and my address is there in case. These slides are available to anyone. I guess, what's the best way? They should.
La compartí con varios de ustedes, pero igual ahorita paso una hoja para que me pongan su correo y se las envíe.
So, as soon as you do that, Mario could send the slides around and you can be looking as we're going. What I want to start with is just a basic introduction. And what we're doing is really trying to question certain very basic things about phonology, the assumptions we make as we develop phonological grammars. And fundamentally, we're saying this sort of came out, it emerged from being concerned about the basic assumptions. We have a history in generative phonology of saying there's UG, universal grammar, and it has various properties, and we're trying to discover those. And in a way, the problem is you can always say, well, this is because UG is this way. But how do we know it's that way? And how do we, you can always say, well, it's just a property of UG, and that's what it's like. But there were two things that worried us. So one is, how do you falsify that if someone says this is part of UG? And the other side of things was feeling like many of the most persuasive principles in UG were actually quite transparent. So, for example, in earlier work that Diana and I did, we were looking at the importance of the phonetic context, and simply that many things were coming directly out of the structure of speakers' bodies, their ears, their mouth, and so on. And if this is the case, you don't need to build those things into a universal grammar. They're simply part of being human. So what we were trying to do in this kind of work was basically say, let's make the minimal assumptions possible. Let's try and pare down the assumptions we need to make specifically about language and see how much we can account for without all of those things. So that's kind of the big thing. One of the results is that we think we can eliminate underlying representations. We've found no convincing evidence for that sort of abstraction. We're interested, fundamentally this brings you to learning, because if you're going to look at these properties, you're always thinking, okay, how would a child encountering data like, whatever it is from a particular language, how would that child go from encountering that data to the grammar? What would the grammar look like? And always coming back to why would a child, posit a grammar of a particular type? Obviously, I say obviously, but I think it is obvious. We need to encode productivity. So people's ability to create new forms is clear. Their ability to understand forms that they haven't heard before. So these are things which you need to be able to do. And so a lot ended up coming out of things like, just the conditions governing strings and so on. One of the things we'll talk about is opacity, where by opacity, what I mean here is derivational opacity, the kinds of cases where the sort of rules or generalizations we have do not seem to be consistent with the surface forms that we're observing, and how we account for those kinds of cases. And one of the big points ultimately is the last one, abstractness, where we're going to be arguing when I say we, it means me and Diana, and when I say I, it means that probably I'm responsible. I don't know, it doesn't mean anything. But arguing against abstractness. So we end up having a model which is very concrete, and where to the extent that you need very abstract kinds of representations, those kinds of things we think are quite suspect. So that's kind of the direction this is all headed. I was telling Mario, I put in a whole bunch of references here on work that we've been doing, and you can get those from the slides. And I wasn't organized enough to bring all of those as PDFs or something, but if there's anything you're interested in, please just let me know. So we started, any questions so far? All good so far? So these are not all of the principles we're starting with, but they are some. So we're assuming, for example, that humans can remember things. Right? So we have to start with memory. And I think this is often the importance is underestimated. I mean, we know that you have to memorize lexical items. We go back to de Saussure or someone, we know that there is there may be not complete arbitrariness, but there is arbitrariness in the in the lexical items that we observe. So you need to learn those things. We learn a huge amount of stuff. So you have to simply remember that dog, is chien, is allá, is, whatever, perro, like you have to learn these things. You have to memorize it. And so that's something that's clear. We can also, we assume, and again, I've given one reference here, there's much more discussion in the book, but humans are good at determining similarity. The two things are similar to each other or they are different from each other. And again, the point about these bullet points here is that this is not linguistics. This is linguistics, but it's not specific to linguistics. So we can detect similarity in all kinds of things, including auditory events. It doesn't stop at what is important for language. So we can determine similarity between speakers. We can determine all kinds of things, non-linguistic sounds, linguistic sounds, visual stimuli. So again, determining similarity is something we're good at. Frequency effects. This is not a linguistic thing. Again, it's true for language, but it's not specifically linguistic. So, and it's also not specifically human. So there are lots of experiments showing that animals, mammals, primates, birds, can do things where they clearly establish an ability to process the frequency of certain things and then react accordingly. So again, this doesn't seem to be, it's something which is important for language, but it's not necessarily something which is language specific. And the last one, and this is really important, is that humans are definitely able to generalize, to go from some specific events to making generalizations of a larger nature. And again, this does not seem to be specifically linguistic, but is crucial for understanding language. So the fundamental point that we're kind of building things on is the assumption that we can do all these things, and these are not necessarily linguistic abilities. Yeah?
One question that I would have expected to have learnability in here. Would that be in this order of ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There are, as I sort of mentioned, there's a bunch of other things that this is not an exhaustive list. It's just a list to begin with. And the crucial point there, and with learnability as well, is that we can learn things. And again, that's not something, it's not that we can only learn language, right? And so what we want to do is determine if there are specifically linguistic properties, then we need to try and identify them. But again, the overarching goal we would have is to then say, well, is it specifically linguistic? Or could we attribute this to these more general properties, including things like learnability? So what I want to do here, and that's building off something that Diana and I did in our recent monograph, is use a particular language to kind of illustrate some of the basics. It's ultimately still going to be quite schematic, but to use them to illustrate some of the properties of the grammar that we're talking about and the way they would develop. And so to do that, we're using Yangben, which is a language from Cameroon. And so it's also known as Kalong. And it's kind of interesting for a reason which is ultimately not important in some ways, but one of the reasons we started looking at Kalong is because people had used it, Hyman in particular, as an argument for abstractness. So what he argued was that you needed more vowels in this language than you have phonetic evidence for. And so he posited a vowel system which included a couple of extra abstract vowels and showed how they operated in the system. And then you had absolute neutralization, where they then collapsed with vowels which occur, phonetically. So we started looking at this, and we discovered this dissertation, which came out after Hyman's work, by Boyd. And what she showed very beautifully is that actually those abstract vowels occur phonetically. So ultimately, the kind of analyses which Hyman was proposing probably make sense, but without abstractness, because it actually has phonetic realization of all these vowels, and people had simply mistranscribed some of the things that she showed with acoustic work really are differentiated. So that does become a little bit relevant as we go on, and you'll see why. But so this is a member of the Mbam group of Bantu languages spoken in Cameroon, classified Bantu A62 in the Guthrie classification. And early works was from Polyan and Hyman, and this is where the abstract vowel type discussion came out. I guess the one point this makes is when people make claims about abstractness and so on, you do want to check the data, see if it, and these days we do have the ability to work on things instrumentally, and so you can, sometimes there are, distinctions which are hard to hear, and maybe they're not there, and maybe they are, but check. And again, what I'll be doing depends primarily on Boyd, who worked extensively on a lot of languages in this family, but in this treatment, we're only going to look at Yangben. So here are the vowels. And does this? No. I could just stand up, though. So just in case you're interested, the vowels which were not identified by Polyan and Hyman were the high minus ATR vowels, which is not surprising. This is something which you see in a bunch of languages. But so this is the basic picture. So we have high vowels, both advanced and retracted. We have mid vowels, advanced and retracted. We have low vowels, which must be retracted. All of these vowels come both long and short. Okay? Here's some examples. And this is deliberately just kind of randomly there. I mean, so, if you were a child, you would get some data and you start thinking about it. You start making generalizations. You don't wait. And I think it's clear from the literature on acquisition, and there are people here like Senor Chavez Peon, who know more about acquisition than I do, so you should jump in if I'm saying anything that doesn't make sense. But it's clear that children do not wait for some threshold amount of data. You don't wait until you've perceived N examples, 100, 1,000, 10,000, you start just making generalizations. Basically, if we come back to those early points, children are rampant generalizers. You can't stop them from generalizing. This is true of adults as well. Sometimes we wish we could stop them from generalizing. But so we have a bunch of data like this, and kids will be perceiving it. One thing we'll assume in everything I do here, children by the age of 6 to 8 months have honed in on the categories they're encountering. So they have an inventory of segments. Some argue they understand contrast. I think that's not completely clear. They understand at least in terms of phonetic contrast, but these sorts of segments that will be identified extremely early and before the point at which children are doing lexical development. Okay, so you start perceiving this. So now what? Okay, so here's an acoustic chart, and one thing you can see right away is why would it be the case that people had missed those high retracted vowels? And there's a couple of reasons. So one is that they're just really close. There's a lot of overlap between the high retracted and the mid advanced. This is not something that is very unusual. So if you look at, there have been a whole bunch of acoustic studies of ATR systems, and what you see is something. This is high-tech demonstration. Okay? These are two high vowels, advanced, retracted. Pretty much by definition, if we're thinking acoustics, F1 will be lower for the high advanced one and higher for the high retracted one. These are two mid vowels, advanced, retracted. You might think they should be like this, and sometimes they are. But really frequently they start moving up. And there are a lot of languages where you see exactly this kind of crossover, where acoustically the F1 values of the mid vowels put it as being higher than the F1 values of the retracted high vowel. So this is not surprising. It's true of Akan, it's true of so many languages. If you look, there's some nice charts in the Ladefoged and Madison book on sounds of the world's languages. And so they established this pattern. And how many people have worked on a language like this? Okay, so what is really interesting is that sometimes you encounter this kind of, a language with this sort of 9-vowel system, and you can perceive the vowels really easily. And then in other languages, it's really hard, and you're constantly making mistakes. And as your consultants become familiar with what you're doing, they kind of look at you and say, no, try again on that one. And you're doing the wrong thing. And it's hard to perceive, but it's easy to see why it's hard to perceive. They're very close. So this is kind of the picture. So what would a learner do with this? And the problem is, how do you take these sorts of categories which they're establishing and establish, how they pattern? So we could imagine dividing them on all kinds of different grounds. So the top one, A, we're just taking and saying, well, you could imagine just making a split. All of these ones have F1 values which are quite different than the top ones. You could imagine doing something like in B, where we would just say, well, we could have a partition here. This set is all similar in some respect. You could imagine doing something like in C, where we have these ones, which are similar in some sense acoustically. We could do as in D, where we've isolated the low vowel, and then we've said, okay, all the other ones. So there's lots of ways, and I mean, it's a significant problem to actually establish how do we do this as learners. And it's not a trivial problem, and it's a problem that as phonologists we usually ignore. We call this the mapping problem, but we like to think that this all happens beautifully and cleanly, and that we simply establish that, this vowel is plus low, and these ones are minus low, and so on. But how does the learner, even if you have a universal set of features, how do you map the acoustic entities that you're encountering onto that system? And again, if you come back to this kind of model, or diagram, you can see it's really not trivial. If you encounter something with these kind of stepwise F1 differences, how do we decide that this one belongs to a high class and this one belongs to a non-high class? And it's a non-trivial problem. One thing for sure is that F1, F2 are not the only dimensions. We could think about other acoustic things. Some languages make phonation differences, some don't for some of these distinctions. We have articulatory evidence, and we can see some of these things. It's clear that we're sensitive. Vision plays a role in language in a way that we often ignore. So some of these things we can get evidence. So this is not the only kind of evidence, but it's tricky. What we think happens is that we also become very sensitive to the distribution in terms of frequency of distribution, and we're now moving into phonology. So we have the acoustics on one hand, but it's not like the acoustics establishes unambiguously what the categories are, and then we simply build on that. The idea would be instead that, okay, we're getting these partitionings in terms of acoustic properties, we're getting partitionings in terms of articulatory properties, and we're also getting partitionings in terms of phonological co-occurrence. So I'm going to make a small assumption that we know what words are, okay? And so if we can identify something like words, you start seeing a clear pattern here, which is that if you've got a vowel like oo, it can occur with e, a, or o. But it never occurs with any of these vowels. If you have a vowel o, it occurs with oo, e, oo, a. Never occurs with any of these vowels. And the same thing over here. So there's a really robust kind of distribution here which would distinguish between these two sets of vowels. What have we just done? I mean, we're moving in on harmony, right? ATR harmony. So all of the vowels on the left are advanced, all of the vowels on the right are retracted. But the idea would be that we can simply identify quite rapidly that there is this distinction in terms of frequency. So the frequency of occurrence of an E and an OO is going to be whatever it is, some positive number. The frequency of occurrence of an E with an OO will be close to zero. I mean, there will be mistakes in perception and so on and so forth, but it will be very, very low. So we can start to think of how would these things come together. So here's a possible partition based on acoustics. Again, if you went back to that original chart of the values, it's kind of taking the ones with more robustly separated versus the ones which were less robustly, and you might get something like this. If we were to do co-occurrence based on patterns in words, you would get something like this. So we're starting, you know, the idea is we can start to put these things together. And where there's multiple sources of evidence for a particular kind of partition, that contrast is going to be robust. Where there's only a single kind of evidence for a partition, then the motivation will be correspondingly non-robust. So we might end up labeling, you know, you can do all, I mean, part of this is I should roll up my sleeves or something, but I am, you know, there is magic going on. I'm giving you sort of a way this would schematically work. We come up with some kind of classification then into ATR, RTR. We've got various kinds of identification of being front and round and so on. We're deliberately not, although we use labels which reflect kind of the features people use, our assumption is that this really is emergent in a Melky type sense. And so we're not assuming that we identify some universal set of features, but rather that the categories that we come up with are recurrent and the result of our articulatory apparatus. Yeah. Melky argues that features are not universal and that they emerge from experience with language. And one of the really interesting kind of arguments he gives for that is that if a feature reflects a phonetic property which is unambiguous, there tends to be uniform phonological interpretation of that. So let me give an example. Let's say you have something like a plosive. A plosive is minus continuant, pretty much unambiguously. I mean, you have complete stoppage of the air, you have complete stoppage of the oral cavity, you have complete closure at the velum. It's a stop, right? Let's compare that with a vowel or a fricative, but you know, a vowel. Well, a vowel, there's no closure at all. You've got continuous airflow, you've got free passage through the oral cavity. You may have free passage through the nasal cavity as well. So it's kind of the polar opposite. So if we were looking at a feature of continuancy, there's no question that a vowel would be plus continuant and a stop, a plosive, would be minus. On the other hand, if you look at a segment like a nasal consonant, M, there it's not so clear, and people have debated, is this a plus continuant or a minus continuant? If you define it by airflow, it's plus continuant. If you define it by a closure in the oral cavity, it's minus continuant. So there's an ambiguity to the acoustics, or to the phonetic properties, because airflow is not really acoustic, but there's an ambiguity to the phonetic properties of continuancy for nasals. So if features were universal, we would expect there to be a correct answer. Nasals are minus continuant, or nasals are plus continuant. There should be an answer. And if you look at the literature, people have looked for those answers. They've looked to try to figure out, are nasals plus or minus continuant? What Melke then does instead is says, well, how do languages treat them? And he looked cross-linguistically at the way nasals pattern in phonological processes, and he found that they pattern in both ways. So in some languages, they behave as plus, some they behave as minus. So his conclusion is, this is evidence that the features are not universal, but are derivative from the phonetic properties. Okay, so that's what we're also assuming, yeah.
So related to that, I think one of our biggest questions are as phonologists and linguists is how much is that given physiologically and cognitively? Because I don't think either you or Jeff Milkey denies that there is some shared cognitive properties and shared articulate properties, plus the specific linguistic set for a given language. Would it be correct to see these three factors or ideas to be said in the game?
I think what Diana and I would say was that what's clear is that we classify. That's absolutely clear. And again, that's not a linguistic property, but it's something that clearly plays a role here. We detect the similarity in certain types of cases. We establish that. If you've got a sort of a bimodal distribution along a particular property line, then we're going to establish two categories. If you've got a unimodal, monomodal distribution, then you'll establish one. So we establish those kinds of categories, but that the postulation of some kind of set of universal categories to be connecting to doesn't really help you. And again, if you look at we're talking here about ATR, if you look at different languages, if you look at the raw acoustics, you really can't tell whether it's advanced or retracted. There's not enough articulatory evidence. So articulatorily, we've looked at a handful of languages, and we do find correlates of advancement and so on. Whether we can go from articulation to categories in a predictable way is I think, unclear. But certainly acoustically, you cannot. If you compare one language, if we go back to, if you look at one language, you'll find that there's a vowel up about here, which is the high advanced one. It ranges from kind of somewhere up here. Okay? If you look, the same thing happens at the back. If you look at the vowels that are mid, they range from kind of up in this area to down in this area. They're all over the place. They're simply all over the place. You can't tell. If I was to just give you a plot and tell you, here's a vowel, what is it? You would not be able to tell me. So first of all, we've got to figure out kind of how does that vowel pattern? What is the case, but this is an interesting kind of problem. What is the case is if you've got, say, this vowel and a vowel down here or something, you say, which one is higher? Okay, well, that's obvious. I mean, there's a lower F1 for one of them. So if we're going to base distinctions on F1, we will be able to say this is a higher F1, this is a lower F1. Yeah. But that doesn't establish whether it patterns as a high vowel or a non-high vowel, as a retracted vowel or as an advanced vowel. So we have this illusion, and I think it's because phonologists operate on symbolic representations, which encode a huge amount of analysis. So we have this illusion that if you get a transcription, you know something about the language, right? But I think it's often really a bit of an illusion. And once you've figured out whether it should be patterning with this sort of high or non-high vowel or something, does it really help you to then say, okay, well, now we know that it maps onto this particular feature or not? I mean, basically, you've solved the problem before you get to identifying the feature. And so why do you need the feature? So anyway, we end up with some kind of labeled set. This is kind of important point number 1 or 2 or 3, I don't know. But so we're assuming that here we start this kind of frequency distribution. If you establish that we have categories, and again, we're assuming human children, human infants do this before 1 year of age, they can then start noticing the frequency of occurrence with other categories that they have established. So we can characterize certain types of sequences as being more frequent than others, and if we're thinking then of if this is to be useful to the child, one way it could be useful is that if you are learning a new lexical item, and it's hard to sometimes hear things, there's noisy environment and different voices and different talkers and so on, that these kinds of things will guide you. So if you hear something that's sort of high and back, and it's coming after something which is also whatever, if we're looking at these tongue root features, the likelihood is that they will agree that you can't have something that's retracted following an advanced vowel or vice versa. These are simply based on frequency of co-occurrence. And so we establish then this general property of just saying we encode into the grammar frequencies directly, frequency distributions. And in this case, we've already motivated an RTR-ATR one, where we don't find words which mix those categories. And so we've started to develop a phonotactic star ATR RTR star RTR ATR. Maybe you can collapse those. Ultimately, the question we keep coming back with is, let's say we want to. The question will be why? Some of this relates to things we were talking about, right? Yesterday, I think, where you can generalize or something, and you can say there's sort of a generalization, or the grammar is less costly, we've got fewer constraints and so on, and maybe that's enough of an argument, but what's clear is that we've got a frequency distribution, which is that you don't find ATR after RTR, and another one that we don't find RTR after ATR. Maybe we can collapse those, maybe we can't. It's hard to know how this would change the behavior of the child, and therefore hard to know how you detect whether there really is a collapsing of these things or not. So this has taken us just to the first thing, which is just sort of one category. We've got a co-occurrence pattern. Another kind of thing you might start to notice is that if we've identified words, all of the final vowels are voiceless, right? In the left-hand column, but not in the right-hand column. So what's going on? So first of all, you can see that certain vowels have voiceless counterparts and certain vowels don't. And certain vowels may be, even though they have a voiceless counterpart, you don't always find it. What we can see, I think, as you go along, is that these 4 vowels do have voiceless counterparts, and the other vowels don't. For us, this means, okay, there's a partition into vowels which have a particular property and vowels which don't. what is this property? Well, again, notice that the property is a combination of distributional effects and phonetic effects. So we are talking about a phonetic property of voicelessness, but we're also talking about a distributional property of being final in these constituents we've established as words, and as opposed to not being final. So this gives us another partition. We've got a partition where these 4 vowels can be seen to be different from all of the other ones. And so we're starting to get, if we bring these together, we've got a partition in terms of the co-occurrence within words, so the harmony partition. We've got a partition in terms of the voicelessness as an option. And then we've got the acoustics, which we had sort of left at this point in the development. And again, the overall idea is that just we keep on building on these things, and the more different kinds of evidence we find for a particular partition, the more robust it becomes. So we can start to essentially assign labels to these groupings, to the partitions. So these labels are simply reflecting the partitioning. And we go on. Actually, before I show this, so, you know, this is assuming a fairly standard kind of labeling. Do we have to do that? So here's what we've done, and this is what Boyd does, and this is ultimately what we use. But if you think about it, it's not clear that we've established this. So we could imagine instead that this is based on height, not ATR. So this group of 3 would simply be the ones which are kind of higher, and then we've got the ones that are lower. So really, the acoustics so far has not established the categories we're using. We could easily imagine that the difference between sort of this vowel and this vowel is actually not high. Here we were assuming this is high advanced, high retracted, mid advanced, mid retracted with this overlap. But we could have assumed that actually, no, the so-called mid advanced vowels are really high. So there is no overlap. And we've mislabeled. And so these are really the high vowels. So what I mean by this is that this vowel is this one. We've just labeled it differently. This one is this one. We've just labeled it differently. And we now have a system where we don't have ATR harmony, we have height harmony. So vowels of the high category can co-occur, and vowels of the non-high category can co-occur. And you might say, well, do we find languages like that? Arguably, yes, although again, whether they've gone through the same logic is not clear. So Chilela is an example, close geographically. So we could just relabel things, and suddenly we have a whole different system, and we would be thinking differently in terms of the phonological categories and so on. Have we changed anything? Right? We haven't. Phonology is the same. We're still saying that as far as this group is concerned, this category cannot occur with this category. This category cannot co-occur with this category. The devoicing applies now to a different set. So now it's going to be the ones which are advanced, which can devoice, instead of being the ones that are high. What does this tell us? I mean, I think what it tells us, again, is back to Melky, right? That if the features are simply constructs which the learner is coming up with, the learner might actually come up with a slightly different set of labels. It's not obvious that this would affect the phonology. But it's a real problem if you assume that there's a universal set of features that we need to map onto. Because in that case, we need to know the right answer. We need to know it's actually the top one, or it's actually the bottom one. And I don't know how you would figure that out. This is like an Escher diagram. If you try and redo these things with these different models, once you've focused on one, it becomes extremely difficult to see the other one. But if you actually, work through the mental gymnastics, it's the same pattern. So what we would argue is that it makes no difference. Ultimately, the phonology is the phonology. We get the same effects. We make the same predictions as far as the grammar of this language, but the labels would be different. This is just the same. So we're going to use the top one, à la Boyd, because it makes it much easier to compare what we're doing with what she did. And it's a standard kind of picture, but really you could do it either way. So this is the mapping problem. I'm pausing for one. Is this all? Okay. Am I going too slowly? Too quickly? Más o menos? Bien, sí? Okay, so let's try and continue. So let's say we've got a bunch of words. And here we've got, yes.
I think that is about linguistic analysis. If you can return before, why don't you, it's not possible to use the binary? Why do you use ATR and RTR and not only one with the plus?
I think in part, so could you all hear? Yeah. Okay, so the question is why we choose to use these labels like RTR versus ATR instead of assuming a binary feature. And really the kind of partitioning we've been doing is binary. So this would be completely amenable to a binary analysis. In effect, if we're partitioning in this way, if you are not ATR, you are RTR, and that's been true of all the categories we've established so far. So we're assuming that you have that kind of partitioning as a guiding force. So we could do that, and in part we just did it because we really want to make it clear that we are not assuming that we map onto this set of pre-established binary categories. And that's the big thing. And the other thing is there are cases, and again, this is just established in the literature, where having a particular property like coronality or labiality or dorsality, that not having that property doesn't really tell you anything about something. So whether both classes are classes that can actively play a role or not is another question. Sometimes yes, like in ATR, RTR, nasal oral, arguably. Right? Sometimes not, as in say, not being labial doesn't really tell you anything about how something would pattern. So in part it's just being agnostic and deliberately wanting to make the point that we are not mapping onto universal categories. Yeah.
Related to that, are you planning to talk about distinctive features in general, or like as a topic later on?
Not really. Yeah. So no, I mean, in a way, we're assuming something along the lines. Yeah, again, the question there was, am I going to talk more about distinctive features? And really not a lot. I do assume that there's something like a Melky type approach and that we do make these categorizations and we establish the partitions and the partitions get labeled. And beyond that, not a lot. What this does mean, though, so it will come up a little bit. So one thing would be a partition can be, and we've seen this, a partition can be based on the phonetics. Here we've just talked about acoustics, but it could be aerodynamic properties, it could be articulatory properties, or a partition could be established on the basis of behavior. And those partitions, they will recurrently coincide. And we think this is because if you're a learner and you've got multiple sources of evidence for a particular kind of partition, it's robust. The likelihood of that persisting and being diachronically transmitted and so on is high. If, on the other hand, it's a very specific kind of thing, the probability is low. You could have a partition which does not readily translate into acoustic goodness or articulatory goodness or so on. These are the kind of the funny categories, the residue for Melky in You know, there's a literature looking at those kinds of things. So we assume that you could have those, and they do provide a way of simplifying the phonology in certain cases, because we can establish categories which do not depend on transparent acoustics. Would that be a robust category? Kind of depends. If you've got lots of data in the language supporting the existence of that category, then it would be expected to be robust. But if the evidence is less robust, then you would expect that kind of category to decay in favor of categories that are combining sources. But that's about all I'm going to say. So here, we've got a bunch of words, and you can see we're getting this ku thing. So the assumption is people will start to notice this. I mean, you've got kutime, kutim, kutine, kutin. You know, and so you're getting a lot of words starting with ku. We're also getting a lot of words starting with something different, ku. Are these similar? Well, they are. But we also know that by this point, children have identified that we've got two categories here. We've got the category we're transcribing as high retracted, and we've got the category that we had as high advanced. So these are different. But there is a similarity. They're both starting with a velar. They're both having this vowel which is similar in all respects except for this one specific property. And we're getting it a lot at the beginning of words. So we start moving towards something like this, that you, on the phonological end, you start saying, okay, well, we've got a lot of words with ku, and we've got a lot of words with ku. And then we have to assume that kids at some point are establishing morphosyntactic information, and I'm not gonna talk about that in an intelligent way, but assume that they do know this. We have to assume that, or else we wouldn't be learning these kinds of things. So they would know that these are, whatever an infinitive means, these are infinitives. So we suddenly start seeing that, like, there's a real redundancy here. There's a frequency that when things are infinitives, we find ku at the beginning, often. We also find ku. So we get the two. So we've got now two classes, basically, of infinitives, some starting with this sequence, some starting with this sequence. So if we start to generalize, we can say, okay, it must be that there's this ku which is actually marking this class of infinitives. And there's also a ku which is marking the class of infinitives. So we have two ways of marking infinitive, and it's this way or this way. How do we get there? I mean, so the idea is you can just get there by observing. I mean, these are the forms we see. We see these two kinds of markers repeatedly with infinitives, and so we end up positing the morph set. So this is going to be critical in everything that we do. So the idea is the learner has direct access, basically, to identifying these morphs, and so they establish, ultimately, when you then recognize that these two morphs have a shared meaning, we can group them. In effect, the grouping is automatic. It's just a network that we now know that there are these two ways of representing the meaning of infinitive. So this the comparison here is, if you remove the ku from these cases, notice you end up with something like a root meaning. And the interesting thing in this respect is that if you look at something like dig, you always find team. I'm starting with a simple problem here. As we know, there are lots and lots of cases where morpheme identification would not be anywhere near this simple. But in this kind of case, there's only one sequence that ever occurs with this meaning. And so we end up with a morph set which here would include one member. If you hear dig, you hear team. Or if you hear team, you know it's dig, vice versa. Same thing with something like devour, you have kof. And there's no option here. So some of the morph sets that we've seen so far would include two members. That would be the one for infinitive. Some of the morph sets would include one, because we only ever observe one thing. So we end up with these two things. There's an immediate problem. Well, actually, before we get to the immediate problem, in some cases, there's alternation. I don't know if you noticed that. I went over it really quickly. But we have sets of forms where we do see alternation. So something like rot, we get kuyika. But we get kuyek. So with rot, we would know that, okay, it could be yek, it could be yik. There's no single way of producing it. So the result would be we simply group those together into a morph set. There's two ways of representing rot. Two ways of representing fasten or bind. So, you know, in some cases, there's going to be a consistency that every single time we encounter this particular string of sounds, it's a particular meaning, and vice versa. In other cases, as we saw with the prefix, there's going to be more than one way of doing it. Some roots, there may be more than one way of doing it. And all that the learner is doing at this point is cataloging those instances, okay? And grouping them by morphosyntactic properties, which must be identified for them to be at least at this stage of acquisition.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So you're proposing that, perdón, les vamos a pedir usar el micrófono, que los que están en línea no oyen las preguntas. Se va a olvidar el inglés. Okay, so just to clarify, at the moment you're proposing that there is really no difference between strong and weak allomorphy.
Correct.
Okay, so we have sets of allomorphs, and really doesn't matter if it's predictable by phonology or not, they are exactly the same.
100% correct.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So this leads us, and I'm going to talk about that issue in a minute. So this leads us to an immediate problem. Here I've called it, we've called it the production problem. That we've got more than one way of expressing something. So if we were to look at, something like we want to say X, Y, whatever this thing is, then the question will be, how will we do it? Well, if there was only one allomorph, if there was only one form for X and one form for Y, it would be simple. We just put them together. On the other hand, if you've got more than one way of expressing X or more than one way of expressing Y or multiple ways of expressing both, then we've got a problem. How do you determine which you have? Okay, so that's the issue. So how do we make a choice between options? So let's say we take this case as an example. So we've got two forms for the infinitive. We've got a root to back up, tune, and so we've got two choices. I mean, the answer is probably really obvious here, right? Because we already established that there's a phonotactic. But notice that we did the phonotactic without any notion of the morphology that was word internal, right? We had established that we never had co-occurrence of RTR and ATR vowels. So if we look at this, then the two possibilities for forming the infinitive of back up would be kutun or kutun. This one violates the phonotactic, and the first one doesn't. So we choose the first one. So we'll simply choose the actual member of the morph set, which is consistent with the phonotactics of the language. So again, the overall point would be that we have simply observed morphs which occur with particular meanings. We've identified when they occur with a particular meaning, we group them together. We recognize that it's the same meaning. And we have phonotactics which would distinguish between the particular forms. This, incidentally, wouldn't help us yet with the strong forms, which we'll come to. But in this kind of case where there's a phonotactic difference, we get the appropriate form. And this is the same, right? Just the same with now a retracted form. So if we had a retracted root, we would choose the retracted variant. If we've got more than one morph, so here's a case where, let's say we've got 2 for X, 2 for Y, it's a little bit more tricky, but it's the same point. So if we look at something like the infinitive of fasten or bind, we've got 2 possible prefixes, we've got 2 possible roots. So 2 of the forms are already going to be eliminated. There's 4 possible. Notice, and again, I will talk more about this later, but there is, how many of you are familiar with optimality theory? Okay, so one of the fundamental properties of optimality theory is gen, where we take, for any given input, we generate a potentially infinite set of output candidates from which we choose. And what I would say is just that that idea, as brilliant and interesting as it was, simply doesn't reflect what native speakers of human languages are doing. And in this approach, there is no gen. The only sense in which we have gen is that we take the members of one morph set and we combine them with the members of another morph set to say, you know, what could be the form for some new thing. So this would be a case where, you know, you want to form an infinitive form. You've never heard this word before. You have, or in this context, so you know that there are a couple of choices for the infinitive prefix, you know, there are a couple of choices for the root. You put it together and you figure out what you would get. But that's it. So gen only puts together items which have been preserved. Again, this is the concreteness, that you have to have observed it, or we'll get, sometimes they can be productive. So this would be out, kukut, because it violates harmony. Kukot would be out, because it violates harmony. So we would be left with 2 options at this point. Same thing if we had something like another suffix, like the continuous. Again, we would be able to eliminate 2 of the 4 options by reference to the RTR, ATR phonotactics. So the next thing we need to do is simply invoke one additional phonological pattern, which we haven't talked about yet, which is that if the high vowel is in an open syllable, the retracted form is observed, and if, sorry, is that right? Yeah, okay. Forget the, I was talking about prefix. So here, if this is the form we would get in the open syllable, in the closed syllable we get kot. So we find the high vowel in the open syllable, we find the mid vowel in the closed syllable. So we have to add that kind of phonotactic in. And again, the idea would be this is just another expression of the star XY. That what we're observing is that before a consonant within a syllable, we don't want high retracted vowels. And again, this is taken directly from Boyd. It's robustly, you know, you go through, I could go back to the data set, but where we find these alternations, you systematically find the high vowel when it's in this open syllable, and you find the mid vowel in the closed syllable. So we would have a penalty assigned to RTR high before a consonant. And that's going to do it. The one other thing that we assume, and this is one new class of constraints, is there may be a general preference for a particular value. And we would assume that this is, again, based on frequency, so that across the lexicon as it's emerging, you would, if you find more of one type of vowel than another one, that you would simply record that grammatically. And to a certain extent, I'm now doing things which I haven't established. We don't have a good lexicon for Kalong, you know, Yangben to establish this, but that would be the assumption. So we can have a constraint like star non-high. The closed syllable condition has to outrank that. It's more important because we do get violations, and so you would now get kuyik is worse than kuyek. And here's how we would do that. So we've got tongue root harmony, which would just, again, just be those 2 phonotactics. So that would rule out anything where we have disagreement. The closed syllable condition says that we don't want high vowels in a closed syllable. That would rule out A and B. And so we get the best possible result, which is D. So what I hope I'm kind of showing you at this point is how you can start to generate relatively complex kind of phonological patterns through very simple observation of surface patterns which get encoded as these distributional asymmetries between sequences and or the frequency of a particular feature. Yeah.
Thank you, Doug. It's a broader question about the tableaus and the OT approach that you're using within emergent phonology. So you said you're not considering gen anymore, as at least as it was proposed, and so now you're showing candidates, but just like the crucial candidates for or possible candidates, or how the candidates are shown in this perspective.
So the idea would be that literally you simply have the Cartesian product of this number of candidates, of the number of morphs you've got in a morph set. So if you want to express something like infinitive dig, you will take all the possible morphs for the infinitive and all the possible morphs for dig, and you will put them together, and the phonotactics will then kick in and tell you, here's the best. We are modeling this right now, as you just said, with kind of a fairly standard OT approach. Nothing really depends on that. We could do this with a harmonic grammar. We could do this in a variety of ways. The cases have ended up being simple enough in general that we don't need a lot more than this. So what is really crucial is just saying there's a kind of optimization that goes on where we can identify the specific parameters which are establishing whether something is more frequently occurring or not, and those interact to make this kind of decision. And this simple kind of ranking, we rarely end up with more than a handful of constraints being relevant. And in part, again, I can make a point now, which I was going to make later, there's no faithfulness in this model. So again, it's right, because there's nothing to be faithful to. You take the forms that you've encountered and you try them, and they're all okay. Kind of by definition, you don't posit forms which are unproducible or something, or which you've never encountered, and so there's no sense in which you need to be faithful to an input that you don't have. Exactly. And so there's no faithfulness. That simplifies the computation massively. As we'll see, and as we saw yesterday, I mean, there's more that goes on in terms of feature identification of certain morphs. So the choice becomes often quite simple, which means that you could imagine this being modeled in slightly different ways and it would work. So we've just adopted this kind of standard simple model. So these are just examples. Here I parenthesized the non-high just because it's unclear in some ways whether something like saying star non-high, are we really only assessing the cases where you've got an option? Like here we've got no option of, it's going to be high. So that's going to violate star non-high. You have no choice. Include that, don't include it, makes no difference. There's no choice. Where this kind of thing is relevant is where you have a choice, and where one of the morphs violates and one doesn't. Now you've got a choice, so it plays a crucial role. But in other cases, you'll simply have something where, high vowels are less frequent, but this morph has one. So here's kind of just summarizing where we've been heading anyway. So richness of the base. There is no rich base. It is not the case that we would say anything goes in a UR. And this is a really crucial difference because it means that we are formulating constraints on forms that occur on the surface. And so it's much more akin to a model that has morpheme structure constraints than to anything like OT. So we are not getting generalizations strictly by this, ranking of constraints which can apply to any kind of input. The forms that a learner posits will be based on what the learner hears. This is so obvious, but it sounds stupid. So, if you don't hear it, you're not going to posit it. Why is dog dog? Because you hear it as dog, right? So you simply posit forms which correspond to what you perceive. And when you've got multiple forms which you have heard corresponding to a particular meaning, then you're going to have to choose between them. But so there's nothing like richness of the base. Everything is based on what you observe. There's no gen. We simply have a finite set of candidates in any given case, which is the result of combining the forms that we get in a given morph set. There's no faithfulness, because everything is just given to you in the morph sets. And there's nothing universal about this. There are no universal constraints. There's no universal anything at this point. It's all being derived from experience and sort of coming up, generating generalizations based on sort of generalizing from partitionings that are based on co-occurrence patterns and acoustic and other phonetic properties.
If there is not universality, there are not different ranking for other languages, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay.
So, I mean, and it raises questions for things like the emergence of the unmarked or things of this type. So things where in OT, there is a certain amount of mileage that people have gotten out of saying that there are constraints which play a role, and then ones that don't, but may play a role in some specific context. And in this model, you end up with you would end up with fewer constraints playing a big role, because they have to kind of become important enough to be doing something. And if it plays no role, it won't be there. And if a feature plays no role, it won't be there. So one difference would be, and it's not always discussed, but let's say we take the features involved in forming click consonants. Well, according to OT, those features, whatever they are, would be required for every single human language.
As any other feature.
Right. So if we need a feature for sphinctering, as you know, when we think about epiglottals and we think about pharyngeals and the differences in there, people like Essling have proposed these very specific kind of phonetic features. And the implication of universality is they should be there in every language. And this model would say, no, they aren't. We have a core set which simply derived from, I take that back, we have a set which simply derives from the properties of the language that you're encountering. But the limitations then will be imposed by your body. So we perceive differences in F1, that's a fact. So we can establish a category based on something like higher, lower F1. So it's universal in the sense that human beings have certain things that they can do, and languages will reflect those things, but it's not universal in the sense that we have to pre-establish a set of categories. So we would expect those categories which are robustly motivated in terms of our auditory and articulatory systems to be recurrent, but not that we have to pre-establish them. But it leaves problems for us, like emergence of the unmarked is something which we should be thinking about and have to come up with an account of. Yeah.
Sorry. This is useful.
Gracias. There was an idea years ago, maybe decades now, that a rejection of the idea that they could be many things in the lexicon, and that's why we have now all the apparatus of having all in the phonology. And it was argued that that was because a problem of memory size. I don't know how do you see that, because I see that we are in the emergent model, we are going to have so many forms now in the lexicon. So I would like to know how do you see the problem? Is really a problem? Because I think recent studies have said that that is not really a problem, the memory size. I would like to know how do you see that?
Yeah, I would start by repeating what you just said. The recent studies seem to show that that's not really a problem. So it was clearly a problem by assumption. And so the assumption was storage is costly. We want to avoid storage, so we need to simplify. And recent evidence seems to be that no, that's not the case. And I think on the one hand, if you look at the literature on, say, exemplars, there's lots of evidence that very specific kinds of memories are retained about the kind of events where items were encountered and so on. And again, that sort of thing suggests that there's not really a memory issue. There's another, this is anecdotal, but again, I kind of think that at times that whole memory storage thing was monolingual authoritarianism. How many languages can a person speak? How many different lexicons can they encounter? Has anyone ever discovered a community where you had 10 languages, say, being spoken, and suddenly with the 11th, no one was able to learn it? All right? It's not like that. I mean, so I don't know, I'm waving my arms to something. I'm not a psychologist, I haven't worked on memory, but it just, as you say, it seems like the current evidence is that this is really not an issue. I think where there might be an issue would be things relating to the topic I've been ignoring, but that you pointed out. So if you have a network of forms, all of which are related in predictable ways, it would seem to me that that is going to be easier to keep in memory than a system where we have that network and then you've got outliers which don't pattern, and you have to kind of remember those ones as a special outlier. And so I think we would expect that that cost would be more. And we might see a tendency to eliminate cases which are truly exceptional, again, depending on their frequency. But that in general, our assumption going into this is simply that, yeah, memory is not costly, and that what would be costly would be not being systematic. So it's the system that's important, not the memory part.
Well, now that you are saying that you are using like a model kind of optimality, my doubt is this modeling that you are proposing is trying to be a computational system, like a derivational model or like optimality, or it is just I don't know, a resource to explain your proposal, but you are not compromised to let's say a real-time computation.
Yeah, I absolutely wouldn't see this as something which you would be doing online every time or something like that. So in that sense, it's a model of what is grammatical and what is not. I would draw a line between, if you have forms which you've encountered, then you need them, you produce them, and you would store them.
Okay.
But if you have something where you need to say something that you've never said before, then you're going to be able to produce it, and it's going to have these properties. What would the properties be if you want to produce a novel form?
Okay.
What would the constraints be? And the idea would be that those constraints are based on exactly this kind of pattern, where you're going to base them on your knowledge of the items that are composing that item,
Okay.
and on the sorts of phonotactics which govern the combination of those items. And it will take longer, and we know that's true, right, with processing. So the forms that you've never encountered would take longer than ones that have.
Okay. Oh, okay. So in your model, I don't know, I am thinking on Esperantization rule of voiced plosives in Spanish, like bebé and tu bebé. So you would be assuming that this rule would only apply the first time we hear this word, and then we only put it in the right context without an online computation from a underlying representation with a plosive?
Yeah, and I mean, one of the other things that this implies is that you don't lose information. And again, I think that there's evidence for that in the psycholinguistic literature. So you don't automatically strip it away, like in a case where you've heard something that you then create this abstract representation in terms of morphs and whatever, an underlying representation, and suddenly you lose that original form. It's a very funny kind of thing in a way. The more you think about it, that generative phonology has done. They've imposed this strange straitjacket where you encounter forms, you create a UR, and then the computation has to proceed in a way that acts as though you'd never heard what the surface form is, and you create this form, and hopefully your grammar was correct and you get the right form. But clearly that seems really unlikely. I mean, we know those forms that we encounter, and so you would expect to just produce them and so on. But so I think one place that we have been led by this is to think that you could really imagine things in more than one way. And speakers might differ in terms of the extent to which they impose structure on forms that they use. And even the analysis of certain forms could differ for different speakers. So if you encounter a form with multiple morphemes, you can produce it, and some speakers will analyze that, and some speakers won't, and conceivably this will affect the way they would respond in various kinds of experimental contexts. But clearly there's absolutely no suggestion that we have to strip everything away and that we have to generate it in an online kind of fashion.
Thank you.
Okay, so pausa? Okay, it's a good point.
Muy bien. En cuanto 15 minutos, en 15 minutos podemos regresar, ¿verdad? No, pero sí me interesa. Ok, ya regresé.
Okay. There's nothing worse than someone who's pacing, right? So if I'm moving around too much, just say, take it easy, slow down. So what I'm hoping to do in the second part of today is talk about productivity, okay? And my goal basically for today is to give you a basic idea of some of the core components of what we're proposing. And what we're proposing is that you take those core components and you can account for just about anything so that we observe. So obviously that's probably false, but that's kind of what we're hoping. And so that's what I'm trying to do today. Then tomorrow, my plan is to talk about first of all, that horrible you word, you are. Why? Why? And, one thing you need to be aware of is that anything I'm being critical of is also being self-directed, because I've been assuming all these things for years and years, decades, right? But one of the things that I found most interesting about this whole project that I've been engaged in with Diana is that it's making us think about things in a different way and really trying to say, okay, things that we have just assumed, should we be assuming them or not? And if we stop assuming them, what do we lose? Or I think what we end up arguing is, what do we gain? And we sometimes gain a lot by rejecting some of these things. So that's kind of what we've been doing. But so tomorrow I wanted to talk about underlying representations and why we had them in the first place and why we think you don't need them. And then look at cases which kind of arise, so many things then arise directly from them. So looking at cases of derivational opacity, which we suggest just kind of disappear, some of these cases, and I won't be able to talk about all of them, but some cases. And then looking at some cases of abstractness, and again, suggesting that a more concrete model does not actually lose generalizations, and that we don't want and we don't need the kind of abstract representations that we've been adopting, and in particular with underlying representations. So that's kind of tomorrow. But before we get there, it's clear that speakers are productive. We produce forms that we've never heard, and we interpret forms that we've never heard. And so we have to build in productivity into the model, and so that's what I want to talk about now. So we can have novel morphosyntactic feature combinations. I mean, you might have forms that you've encountered. You've heard rot in one form, but you've never heard it in the continuous. Or you've got, a variety of different things. So we need to be able to account for how we get those productive forms. So two kinds of things. First of all, is just assuming that the morphosyntax can combine in ways that you've encountered or you haven't. We can create things. You need to say something. You need to use a particular verb. You need to use a particular form of a noun, and you haven't heard it, so you create it. Okay, so we need to be able to do that, and the morphosyntax will generate these combinations. And the next part of this is that your morph sets have to provide the forms that you need. And so this is where I want to talk about that, basically. So let's say, the example here would be, you've encountered yik, but you need a form that doesn't have a high vowel, like yek. So we need to account for how you augment the morph sets to include forms which have not been encountered. So that's what we want to do. So the basic observation, this comes back to the discussion we were having during the break, right? That humans cannot stop generalizing. They cannot stop identifying patterns. If you want to prevent a child from observing a pattern or from generating a pattern, I don't know how you would do this. You can't do it. Like, we just do it. Yeah, exactly. Only by depriving them of stimulus, basically. Put them in a box. I'm not even sure that would work. They would, they would probably generalize about their environment. It might be a sad situation. But so the point is, humans, we don't even want to go down that road. But anyone here on an ethics committee, we will not approve the experiment. Okay? But what this means is, let's say you've got something like yik yek, kut kot. You encounter these forms, right? We reach the point where we've identified that each of these forms is a form of rot, or kut kot are both forms of fasten or bind. So once you've got that, the idea is that speakers will not stop, but will start to look at the content of this set of related forms and look for generalizations, look for patterns. So in a case like this one, we would identify that if you've got a form that is high and RTR, there's a corresponding form which is mid and RTR. If you have a form that's high in RTR, there's a corresponding form that's mid in RTR. So you start to observe that there's a relationship between those forms. And that's what we call an MSR, so a morph set relation. And we formalize those. So you've just simply got a case like this. We've got two morphs in a set. If you've got a form that's high and it's RTR, there will be a corresponding form that's non-high. Anything that is not stipulated in the MSR would be assumed to not change. So if you don't stipulate a change, the assumption will be it's kept identical. We'll return to that a little bit later. But so this would be a morph set relation. So far, all it's done is said there's a relation, and the relation is systematic. Okay? What do we do with that? Well, and we separate these out into two things because it seems like sometimes relations give rise to productive patterns and sometimes they don't. So there are cases where, let me give an example, where you say you observe something which can be high or non-high, but you also find things that are only high and there's no alternation, and there are things which are low. If we took Margee tone, for example, you have morphemes which are low and they are just always low. They're low, tono bajo, not much to say, right? And there are forms with only high. And then there are forms that alternate. In a case like that, we would assume that the learner identifies that in these alternating forms, there is a relationship between low and high. But that's the end. We would not want that observation to give rise to positing highs for every single low tone noun or verb, or lows for every single high tone noun or verb. So number one, we can establish a relation, and then the question is, do we augment the morph set or not based on that relation? So that's where a morph set condition comes in. So the idea, just to read it or something with respect to this MSR we just saw about the high-mid pattern, a minimal morph set is ill-formed if there's a morph with a high retracted vowel and there's no corresponding morph with a non-high vowel. So it basically looks then at the structure of these sets and says, we find sets where we only have mid-retracted vowels. We don't find sets which only have high retracted. So if you encounter a set that's got a high retracted vowel, you're going to automatically generate a form of the other type. So that's the MSC. So it's just saying for a particular relation, a morph set may be ill-formed. So this is really just saying, not that the form is ill-formed, but that the set is ill-formed if you've got one morph and not the other. And that's going to augment your morph sets, and that provides the input to productive relations. And this is now, we are pretty much at the point where we're addressing your earlier comment, right? So if we looked at an example like go went, is R, these are just allomorphy. You learn it, you establish your sets, they have their properties, you choose the appropriate forms based on the morphosyntax, but there's no general pattern in terms of the phonology. So there's no MSR. We would therefore have no MSC. So you would only generate new forms based on establishing a relationship, but the relationship in and of itself is not sufficient to create new forms. You have to see that there's actually a systematic lack of forms which don't have the second form. Making sense? So that's the basic picture. So in Yangben, we would augment any form which has an I or an U only, and we would add a form. So here's a toy lexicon. We observe various kinds of cases. I don't know how to so, you know, you might observe things like this, which are high and advanced. You could observe things which are mid and advanced. You would observe things which are mid and advanced and long, and so on and so forth. If you look at all of these forms, we do see that you've got some which have two forms, right? They're the ones that we're interested in. That would lead us to the MSR. And notice that the MSR is specifically between high and non-high, and it's specifically between forms which are retracted, hence the formulation before. So these kinds of forms would lead to the establishment of the MSR. From there, we're now going to have additional forms where we see certain things like yik, where we have not observed a mid-retracted form, let's say, and where we're now going to generate it. Or a form like puk, where we haven't observed a particular form which has the retracted one, so you would generate it. And so these forms will now be available for lexical insertion. Notice that if it's not, so like, let's say you observe a form which is mid-retracted. You're not going to know whether there's a high vowel form that corresponds or not. What's the prediction? I mean, the prediction, I think, is quite clear that we would expect to see errors in that kind of case. Either that, you know, occasionally people might produce a high form, or maybe not. Maybe there would be systematic awe, but at least there's a difference between these kinds of cases and these ones, where we would expect the presence of a high vowel to give rise to both. We would not expect the same for the mid vowel, because we find lots and lots of cases with mid-retracted vowels and no high counterpart. So the basic idea then, and again it comes back to the observations about lexical storage, yes, this does result in a larger number of items being stored, but they're systematic. That's like end of theoretical interlude. Now we've done productivity. So I'm pausing if there are any questions right away. If not, I'm going to give an additional illustration, right, which is basically the same things. So what I want to do for the rest of today is just, you know, everything I've done over and over again, just more cases, just to try and kind of cement the mechanisms in place so we can talk about various implications tomorrow. So what about the causative? I'm sure this is what you've all been asking. What about the Yangben causative? right? So if you look at the causative, we see that it's marked by a high suffix. And you may also notice that I've been ignoring tone. Ultimately, we need to address tone. I've just been ignoring it today. It's there. You can try and figure things out. But there's lots of interesting stuff going on there as well. So here we've got a high tone suffix, a high vowel, low tone, in fact, suffix. And if we have a root like suk, nothing really is different. But if you've got something like full, which is retracted, then we get an advanced form. Similarly, if we have something like sok, we get an advanced form. Pal, notice here we get an advanced mid-vowel, not a low vowel. And ket, same thing. Yik, yik. So what's going on, right? I mean, this is a fairly straightforward pattern, I think, where we've got an advanced form on the suffix, and so we get advancement on the root and on the prefix. How do we deal with that? Well, what should be really clear from what I've, hopefully clear, tell me if it's not clear, say something, right? But hopefully it should be clear from what we've done before the break that we're going to have to set up morph sets which include multiple forms. And again, why would we do that? Well, we would do that because we observe it. So we observe both of these patterns. We know there's a contrast between advanced and retracted high vowels. So it's not simply that these are close enough to each other. I mean, they aren't. These are contrastive phonemes. So we're going to establish a morph set that includes both the advanced form and the retracted form. This is just more examples. Okay, so we've got these tongue root alternations in these roots. So what do? Well, we set up morph sets. Are they systematic? Yes, right? We have retracted forms corresponding to advanced forms where all other features are the same, except if we have a retracted low vowel, then we find an advanced mid vowel. So there is no advanced counterpart of the low vowel phonetically, and so what we observe in these sets is the alternation is with an advanced mid vowel. So that's the relation. So if we have a morph that's retracted, we have a corresponding morph which is advanced and non-low. Okay? And so then we have an MSR which says a minimal morph set is ill-formed if there's a morph with a retracted vowel and no corresponding morph with a non-low advanced vowel. In other words, we have to stipulate, and this is what we're assuming, that you have to stipulate both non-low and advanced because that's the observed set of differences. And so if we only have a morph that has a retracted vowel, that's going to be ill-formed. But notice that this is a one-way relation. So take something like this A. Let's say you observe a form which is mid-advanced. What are you going to do? Is the form that you would like it to be paired with something. You would like to have a form that occurs in the retracted environment. But is it mid or low? So the simple observation here, which is based on learning, is that really you cannot tell. So we cannot productively produce the retracted form based on the advanced one, at least not in all cases. So this is going to be a one-way relation in terms of morph set conditions, that if you encounter a retracted form, we know that there will be a corresponding advanced form. But if you encounter the advanced one, you are not going to be able to know which of the other forms you would encounter. And in a way, sort of looking ahead towards various cases of opacity, the problem here is that you cannot know what the form would be unless you hear it. So you have to hear it, right? So I mean, again, what we would, and there's no way around this, and we can make fancy kinds of assumptions about representations and interactions, but the fact is, the child would not be able to know what the correct form is unless they encounter it. Yeah.
Have you observed mistakes in children doing like hypercorrections, like pel instead of pel?
That's the prediction.
Okay.
Where's Mario? Right? This is so anyone else who does acquisition here? So we're making a million predictions about acquisition, and that's one, and we don't know what the facts are. And I think as far as acquisition work on Yangben, unfortunately, I don't know of any, but so that's the prediction though. So it's a one-way relation. But so what we would get here is that, let's say we take something like this, Suk. It's high, it's advanced, it's not subject to the MSR. There's no, we wouldn't expect any augmentation of the morph set. And so if you plug that in, you're going to get A. Satisfies tongue root harmony, there's no closed syllable. Actually, it violates star non-high, so this is wrong. Right, but notice it won't make any difference. So, yeah, correct this. I will correct it mentally. Okay? What about a case like this one? So if you've got two forms, then we get more possibilities. So we've got one form for the causative, we've got two for the root, we've got two for the prefix. That gives us 4 possible surface forms. 3 of them violate harmony. This one because we've got retracted, followed and preceded by advanced. B because we've got advanced preceded by retracted. D because we've got retracted before advanced. So these would all be out, and we're left with the one which is all advanced. There's a crucial piece of, there's a crucial thing to notice about this. And this is where my favorite name for this particular model is, it's stupid phonology. Because I feel like we're constantly making these generalizations which just sound so stupid. So in OT, there's a problem here. The problem is that you can freely generate candidate outputs. So one of the possible candidate outputs would be one that has a high retracted vowel at the end. In general, in Yangben, there's a preference for retracted vowels. So all else being equal, we would expect to see something like everything being RTR to be better than what we see here. Okay? That would be reflecting all of the phonotactics I've got here, except it would also satisfy that preference for retraction. And in fact, maybe we should make them all mid, since there's a general preference for non-high vowels. So what do? So we have to say, well, in order to prevent that from happening, we're going to invoke this whole new class of constraints called faithfulness, and we'll say that specifically we posit a particular value for the causative underlyingly, and then we have to retain that value, and that's going to have the ripple effect that will get advancement throughout. So what do we say? Well, we say it's advanced because it's advanced. That's why I call it stupid phonology, because why do we say that the causative is advanced? And the answer is because it's advanced. Right? It's advanced. It's always advanced. It's advanced. And so because it's advanced, it has this impact on other things. So often we get this effect. And again, the crucial theoretical point is because we don't have faithfulness, we don't have gen, so we simply see these combinations, and that's the end of it. And the question that Diana and I have continually asked each other is, we kind of come up with these kinds of things, and then we say, so have we missed something? Because it's, a fairly obvious result, and that's it. Okay, so as I mentioned, I mean, there's this overall preference for retracted forms. So with something like this, if there's no, now we've got two forms for the root. So do we choose something like sok, or do we choose sok? And so here the idea would be there is a general preference for retraction. It's our impression that retracted vowels are more frequent in general than the advanced ones in this language. And so we would get the effect of this prohibition on advancement actually causing you to choose C over, or rather B over C in a case like this one. So it can be a role, but it's only going to be a role when you've encountered both types of forms and you're choosing between them. And this is just another case with the causative. Adding in this preference for retracted vowels has no effect when we've already decided the case. So here's kind of a summary of where we are to date. So we've observed morphs. We grouped them into sets. In effect, we actually assume there's nothing, it's not like you're really overtly grouping them into a set. The point would be this: if you and I speak a language, you encounter a form, and we have more than one form which has the same meaning, then what that means is saying they have the same meaning, A and B mean the same things, means we've made a set. If we were to say A and B are pronounced the same way, we've made a set. Right? So simply the observation of a relation between forms is the establishment of a set. So we can now talk about grouping all these things that we've observed into sets based on morphosyntactic information, based on phonological information, based on whatever we've observed to be similar between these items. So that's kind of point one. MSRs would be then that now that we have these sets, we can identify that there are commonalities between items within the sets. Those commonalities could be morphosyntactic. I mean, the ones that we're particularly interested in here are phonological. And then if we need productivity in terms of producing a particular morphosyntactic kind of unit that we've never encountered, we would then put together the relevant things that mean those things, whatever that is, dog plus plural. And then lastly, the phonotactic constraints would help us choose between. Okay? So
I'm sorry.
stop saying you're sorry. It sounds too Canadian. Canadians say they're sorry.
I also say.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm really not that familiar with stump realizational morphology model, but what you propose here seems to me a little bit similar from what I know. Is your model compatible with that morphosyntactic oriented functional model, or is just like a coincidence?
I would say there's no, I mean, a lot of this stuff is not coincidence, and it's not like these are ideas which have come out of the void or something. So these are ideas which have precursors. It's not Stampian in the sense that we're assuming there are kind of universal rules or something which then behave in a particular way. So in that sense, it's really different. But in some ways, it's very similar, yeah. Okay. Let me look at another example. One of these, actually, for those of you who were here yesterday, I'm kind of leading towards one example that I talked briefly about yesterday and sort of giving you a bit more detail on it. So this is, Yangben is a Bantu language, which means we have noun classes. So you have, here are some of them, 4, 5, 7, 8, 10. These just illustrate the different classes. And so we have prefixes which are chosen based on the class. Okay, so You have a different prefix set for class 4 than you have for class 5, class 7, etc. These have particular meanings in terms of singular, plural, sometimes augmentative, diminutive, these kinds of things. And so here's the picture. What you notice is that all of these prefixes, all of them, have both advanced and retracted forms, right? So we have a bunch of roots which may or may not alternate, many of them don't. But then we've got these two choices of prefixes, so you would have something like E in class 4 with an ATR root like meku, but we would have E in something like itim. What's this reflecting? Tongue root harmony. So the phonotactic is clear, we've seen it before, and this is just to show it's a very robust kind of pattern. So in these class prefixes, we have a general preference for retraction. We've talked about that. But tongue root harmony, the star ATR, RTR, RTR, ATR, would be more important than simply avoiding retraction, avoiding advancement. Okay? So in an example like this, we've got two forms for, say, ku, ko. Ku is preferred, but ku would be preferred in a context where we have an ATR root. So this should seem like really similar. I mean, this is stuff we've basically seen, and it's just more examples. What we can see, though, is that this was actually a little bit too simple. So there are also non-high class prefixes, and there's a theme here, which I mean, one of the things that I try to do is not base what I'm doing on just a few examples. So like, if there's a methodological goal, it's to really try and push cases that you're looking at and explore the different things. What we see here is that there's a complication with the non-high class prefixes. So class 1, we've got 5 forms suddenly, not 2. Class 2, we've got multiple forms. Class 3, class 6. All right, so we've got a more complex situation. So what are the generalizations? I mean, we're getting a in some cases, in others, a in others, o in others, o in others. What do we have to do? So the first thing that's really obvious, if you're in this kind of model, is a learner would encounter, I'm not going to worry about the nasal. There's also things going on there in that class. I'm not going to worry about it. That's a separate issue. Just like I've been ignoring tone. So there's more. I will not exhaust the topics to be examined in Yangben. Okay, but the learner will observe all of these forms. That's simple. So they would set up a morph set which has a, o, and o. Ma, me, mo, right? There's no other option. Which one is underlying? Trick question, right? We're not worrying about that. Okay, so we would have a morph set that would include these 5 forms. So that's this. Okay, now we've got to worry about how do we account for them. So what we can observe is that with the non-high vowels, we don't want to have back followed by front. We don't want to have a non-round mid-vowel followed by a round mid-vowel. So these are more specific kinds of phonotactics, but we again see this same kind of, the logic is the same, star x, y. And so what we're observing, if we go back to this, if you look at, say, back front, when you've got a front vowel in the root, we get a front vowel, not a back vowel, here. The complication with rounding is that you can see that it's specific to mid-vowels, we don't get non-round round. okay? I'm sort of introducing here a couple of other things. So we've been assuming a kind of a Heinz type model of locality and so on, and what we're targeting. Again, do we need to do this? We're not entirely sure, but it's for concreteness, that's kind of what we're doing. So that's what the F implies, is that the focus of this is to look at non-high vowels. Whereas, say, the focus here is on vowels in general. We define a domain for every phonotactic that we've got. Some phonotactics apply to morphs only. Some apply to words. Some apply to morphs and words. And we believe that you find all of these options in different languages. So for example, in Basque, there's a harmony phonotactic which holds of roots. If you have sibilants, they must harmonize in Basque. That is only true, root internally. So that would be a morph condition which does not hold outside of the morph. It does not hold of words. In harmony, we find cases where something holds both of the roots and of the words. Yoruba would be an example of that, where there's virtually no exceptions to harmony, root internally, except in borrowings, and even then, okay? As opposed to, say, Turkish, where you find huge numbers of violations within root internally, and it operates at the word level. So we want then to define for all of the phonotactics what the domain is and what the relevant class of segments is. And bringing in these issues of roundness and backing, we now also have to, include things like what would you get, all else being equal, and the assumption there is that we get non-rounded vowels. In terms of the inventory, there are more non-rounded than rounded, and again, we assume this just emerges from the frequency of lexical items, but again, that is hand-waving as far as Yangben is concerned. And default low, again, we would assume that, we assume here star non-low. Focus on vowels, assign a violation for each non-low vowel. This, again, I'm going to do more hand-waving, where Bantu, you may think this sounds weird, would there be more low vowels? And sometimes they're really high frequency, the low vowels. So again, we don't have the data for Yangben, but it's not as crazy as it sounds to think that low vowels are preferred. So here's an example. So the logic here is exactly the same as before. No difference. It's just getting slightly more complex because we're bringing in more properties and there are more candidates. So we've got something like milk. Milk is retracted mid. That's it. Remember, the MSR only applied to expand the set if you've got a retracted high. Retracted mid, just star retracted mid. So that's that. So we've only got one option for the root. Then we've got 5 options for the prefix. So something like A, that's simple, it's bad. Why? Because the vowel is advanced, the root is retracted. So something like A and E are going to be out because of tongue root harmony. Okay, there are no rounded vowels here, so that's irrelevant. Well, it could be relevant, but it's ultimately not the way it was formulated. So as far as dorsal harmony, we don't want back vowels before front vowels. The root here is front. And so the best thing we can get is B. And yeah, this is not perfect. There are various non-high vowels and there are various non-low vowels and so on. But we're actually done at this point, right? So the point is that we simply don't want to violate dorsal harmony. What happened here?
You made zoom with your arm.
With which?
No.
It's not. Interesting. Ah. I love it. Me gusta mucho. Which means I probably did this when I inadvertently touched the screen. Ah, yes.
Podría también
Ah, está bien.
anotar cosas, ¿verdad, Toño? Si quisiera, entonces.
Podría anotar.
You can write stuff.
Oh, I can write stuff. Oh, cool.
¿Con qué? Con el
Por
dedo.
ese pizarrón.
Ah. Bueno.
Como así. No,
Okay. This was a technical, this was the equivalent of standing up and stretching. So if we take something, so this is the one we already, now let's see what happens. Okay, so if we've got something like low key, so here we've got a rounded vowel. So again, this is advanced. That's going to rule out any of these candidates which have a retracted form. And now labial harmony is going to rule out a case where we've got a non-rounded mid-vowel, non-high vowel. Actually, I think this one's a mistake. Right? I said mid-mid. Labial harmony is applying to mid. This is a mistake. But it's irrelevant. The point is that these mid-vowels that are not rounded would be ruled out before a rounded vowel, and again, we're done. So what this case is showing us is two things. First of all, that I make lots of stupid mistakes. Second, that they don't matter. Right? But so the logic here is exactly the same. We observe this discrepancy between the distribution of rounded vowels, non-rounded vowels, between back vowels, front vowels. We see that it's a more restricted kind of generalization. We encode that as a phonotactic, and it chooses between the candidates. Here's one more example where tongue root harmony would rule out B, C, and D. The root is only advanced. And this is an example where it then defaults down to the other features. So we've got two candidates that are potentially in the running at this point. Both of them involve a non-high vowel, so that's, that won't help us. Both of them have two non-low vowels. Again, that's not going to help us. Both of them involve two advanced vowels, so again, that's not going to help us. But the difference is that this one has two round vowels, and this one doesn't. So this is the winner. So we see that the effect of this rounding, the labial harmony, is restricted to the mid-vowels and won't have any effect on a case like this one. Yeah, maybe this is a good one still to just mention. The interesting thing here is, so we get, here's a case where we get ah before something that is not ah, right? So again, now we've got a retracted root, so we can't have an advanced prefix. Labial harmony only applies between mid-vowels. This vowel is not mid. The back requirement says that we can't have a front vowel before back, but then ah and o would both be possible. And so again, we do, in terms of the various featural things, non-high won't distinguish between the three that are left. ATR won't distinguish, but we have a case where we don't really want round vowels. If we can prevent it, that would give us either B or C, and we don't want non-low vowels if we can avoid it, and so the best thing is going to be ah. So the overall point of kind of this sort of example is that we're really just seeing the same things, but we are starting to gradually get more complex patterns. So here we've got a pattern that's restricted to non-high vowels. It involves two kinds of sub-patterns, the labial harmony and the back harmony. But in principle, it doesn't really involve anything new. So it's simply that we set up the morph sets, we establish what the phonotactics are, and we choose between the options. This case, non-high affixes with retracted high mid. These are the alternating cases. So yeah, we hadn't dealt with that, right? So far, every example I've shown only had one root, right? So let's make things slightly more complicated and look at a case like this where we saw alternation between a high retracted and a retracted mid. So there, what we get is like u, sia, pe, ka. So we get the a, and we get the high vowel, not, and if it's pek, we get low vowel as well. We might have expected the mid one. Let's see what happens. Okay, so I've put up the closed syllable case. This is the one which said you can't have a high vowel, high retracted vowel in a closed syllable. We get the mid retracted. We've got 2 possible candidates for the prefix. We've got 5 possible candidates for the second prefix, and then we've got 2 possibilities for the verb. So you can see there's more possibilities here, but it's still finite. And I've eliminated a whole bunch of them by just assuming that tongue root harmony is respected. And that's just to make this simpler, right? But they would all be there. They would be eliminated by the fact that you never violate tongue root harmony, and so that would be that. Okay. The closed syllable constraint would rule out anything where we've got a high vowel in the root. So that would leave us with these ones with mid-retracted vowels, right? What about labial harmony and dorsal harmony? Well, dorsal harmony would say that we don't want to have back before front, and that would be violated by B and C, right? So the winner would be A, which is not what we want. So here we've got a problem. Clear? So we've got to do something else in this kind of case, because as it stands, we're getting the wrong result. So here's where I want to just expand. This is, I think, the last this is the last expansion for today in terms of range of options. When we say star x, y, what are the x, what are the y? So far, they've always been phonological, but they could be morphological, right? And could we prevent that? This is where, and this is the logic I've been talking about with Mario in the last couple of days, right? So could you say that star x, y, we must be referring to 2 phonological entities? And if we're thinking in terms of emergence, and we're thinking of a bottom-up kind of, coming through the data to what you observe, the answer would be, well, how could you? You would have to have some kind of meta-constraint which says we observe co-occurrence patterns only between objects of a particular type. If you say we observe co-occurrence patterns, period, then we would expect x and y to be any unit that we have established based on the bottom-up kind of process from the data. That would include morphological categories. It would also include phonological. It could mean that we have cases purely of a morphological nature, and I think we do, although I'm not going to talk about them. But for phonology, what it means is that we can have cases which involve prohibitions of morphology and phonology. So what we have just done is we've kind of moved from being purely phonological into the realm of morphophonology. So morphologically conditioned phonological patterns. And so that's where we simply say one of x and y happens to be a morphologically defined category. So in this case, in a minimum morph set, there's a systematic relation between a morph with a high retracted vowel and a morph with a mid vowel that cannot be preceded by a non-low vowel. So we're kind of building in, is this morphological? I don't know. We're going to see more cases. But the point is, this is sort of the extension we're getting to now, where we now have this set of morphs cannot be preceded by a non-low vowel. And that's an idiosyncratic property of this class. So there's two properties here. The high retracted vowels have a non-high retracted counterpart, and that non-high retracted counterpart cannot be preceded by a low vowel, a non-low vowel. Okay? Cannot not be preceded. This process the negatives. Okay? So we add this condition onto the set, which is generated in this way. So now what does that mean? It now means that if you look at the set like pek, pik, these forms cannot be preceded by a non-low vowel. That means that we have a violation here. We also have a violation here. Right? It's only true of the mid-vowel variants. So these ones, it wouldn't make any difference. They'd be out anyway because of the closed vowel requirement, or closed syllable. But so we're adding in this set of co-occurrence patterns based on, again, specific sets of morphemes. So in this case, it's that specific set of forms which have a high vowel counterpart, that they can never be preceded by a non-low vowel. And so what you end up with is the otherwise unexpected a form in front of e. Does this make sense? People's eyes are glazing over. So the point here is there's a complexity to the system that we get an unexpected kind of pattern specifically with the roots which alternate. And that's the observation. And we can encode that observation by exactly the same mechanisms as we've seen so far, but now we've got something where we prohibit a particular phonological category, namely non-low, before this set of morphs. So that set is now defined in this way. Is this making sense? This is the kind of case where if I were in the audience, I would be immediately trying to think, isn't there some other way to do this? And so if you come up with some better way of doing it, please let me know. But the mechanisms are the same as we've been seeing, so we would actually expect this kind of thing to be possible, and we're going to see in a lot of cases, we see all the same ingredients playing a role everywhere. But the ingredients are just this star XY, and they may or may not be restricted to a particular class of morphs. The last thing is one which, and I think yeah, we're almost at time. And so the last thing I wanted to discuss today is the case which we actually saw yesterday. So this is just atypical pairings where things don't work the way they ought to. So this kind of case, we would expect to find a rounded vowel. We just saw that. Here we would expect to see and yet that's not what we get. Here we would expect to get but we don't. So these are clearly exceptional. And Boyd makes that really clear. So most forms work the way they should. Most forms work the way I've established so far, but there are a handful of examples which don't work that way. So what do? Well, the answer is obvious now that so for those morphs, we're going to have a prohibition. So what we say then is that for the class including grass and so on, in those cases, even though we would have expected to find a non-round vowel, we prohibit that. And for forms like head and so on, even though we would have expected to find a round vowel, we don't. And so it's the same mechanisms, but now really clearly moving into just saying we don't get a particular phonological form in front of a particular morphological class. And notice the thing, why would we say this? And this is why, again, I love just calling this stupid phonology. Because why would you do something like that with grass? Because that's what you see. It's just a stupid property of grass. It's just a stupid property of mountain. You know, these forms, how do you know that you're going to have an aw before mountain? Because you hear it. You simply hear, and you would have expected to hear ekel, but you don't. We would expect errors in terms of acquisition in the direction of saying ekel rather than okel. Why do you say okel? Well, you say it because you hear it. And the addition of, say, a floating feature or something really doesn't add anything to this, because you would simply have to say a floating feature is found only in the case of mountain and tree and tail and so on. And in those cases, we then have some mechanism for linking it up or something. But the basic observation is just that we have this co-occurrence restriction where with this class of lexical items, there's a prohibition on what can occur immediately preceding it, and we can encode that directly as a sequential prohibition referring to the morphological class that we observe to have these properties. How do we know something's in that class? You have to hear it. I mean, there is no phonological property that would tell you to expect this. So here's the summary for today. So we observed more. Yeah.
I will say sorry.
Okay, excellent. But you did. Yeah, sort of. It was implicit.
So the lexicon that you show, or the words, seems to me like really common words. Have you seen like a relationship between those core words in a Swedish sense and exceptionality, and in the sense that you do not apply those kinds of phonological generalizations, or is it just arbitrary?
I think the observation would be that I don't know enough about Yangben to really tell you clearly in this case, but the prediction would be the following, that typically this kind of thing, we assume, would result from sort of historical factors. Those sometimes lead to large classes of items being special, and they sometimes result in a few isolated lexical items being special. My expectation would be that if the item is something like tree and high frequency, you're hearing it a lot, the chances of changing and regularizing would be relatively low.
Okay.
And if an item is less frequent, the expectation of regularization would be high.
Okay.
But one thing about this is we do see cases where these kinds of morphologically marked classes are really extensive. So here we're talking about a small number of examples, but there are cases where essentially you've got 50% of the vocabulary works one way and the other 50 works the other, and there is no phonological pattern to tell you, or property to tell you which way a particular form will go. So, but again, I think the robustness of the data is what we would expect to determine whether that's a stable pattern or whether it's going to be a transient kind of pattern.
Okay, thank you.
Is it just about frequency, or it's also about cognition? Like basic in discourse and cognition words like tree, mountain, and head. Does it make sense that something like this can trigger?
Possibly. I mean, I think the fundamental point we would make is that anything which is not specifically linguistic, because that's, I mean, if it is specifically linguistic property, that's really interesting. And that's what, in a way, what we're hoping for. What we're trying to find is those things that we can't derive from something else. If it can be derived from some kind of semantic property, pragmatic property, or something other than the ones I've mentioned, that's completely consistent with what we're saying. Frequency is a clear one in the sense that if it's a high frequency element and it's something like head that presumably we talk about a lot and you hear a lot, then you would expect it to be stable in a way that other ones wouldn't. Although you also see reduction in those kinds of cases, and so that would interact with some of this as well. But the big point would be, yeah, that we're looking for whether there is some explanation other than just saying it's a property of the linguistic mechanism. So, again, the sort of the take home for today is this, again, just to summarize. I mean, we observe things, we group them into sets. The sets, we identify morphosyntactic properties. So that gives us what is for us a really basic unit, which is the morph set. And where the minimal morph set will be a defined set which has a particular morphosyntactic meaning. And this can be syntactic, it could be morphological, it could be semantic, you know, but there will be this class of items which is identified. We have the establishment of relationships inside that set, which is MSRs. And in many cases, this is productive, and so those cases would productively then create enlarged, augmented morph sets, and so that would be where, partly where productivity comes in. And so then words are just going to be the result of the product of these sets. So they will be relatively small, or they may be relatively large, depending on the number of options. And that's going to just depend. But again, in terms of comparison with something like OT, they're tiny. They're a finite set derived from observed forms. And we then say we've got constraints that are going to choose between these options. And you know, the paradigmatic ones, we would have some cases where you just have something which cannot co-occur. And syntagmatic, we're going to have these sequences where we disprefer certain types of sequences. Those sequences could refer to the phonology, or they could refer to the morphosyntax. And that combination will kind of give you the sorts of phonological things we observe. And that's tomorrow. It's 13:02. I cannot believe this. All right. Any other questions? ¿Algunas preguntas más? No? Save them up. Come in tomorrow prepared to fight.
How approach, I don't know how to say this in English. ¿Qué tan cercano is your model to SFP phonology? Substance-free phonology. Or what is your opinion on this?
I think that one big difference is, in a lot of ways, I would call this substance-intensive phonology. Because it really is generating the things from, you know, really paying attention. This is why, you know, the first point we looked at was memory. And so the idea being, what are you memorizing? I mean, you're encountering this linguistic material and you're remembering it. And it's that substance that's giving rise to all kinds of things. And so you start combining this with, say, paying attention to patterns and to looking for generalizations. And the idea is that it's emerging from the substance. So the actual thing that we're proposing in terms of, say, star XY, that's not linguistic. That's beyond linguistics, and can we recognize these different frequencies of distribution and different things? And the answer is yes. And it can involve, you know, can people calculate that if there are two restaurants and they go to them on repeated occasions, that this one is more likely to have one type of food than the other one? Yeah, that's not linguistic. is frequency, but we're getting sort of star food X kind of, that maybe, that's not quite a sequence. But the idea is so that we're really taking these non-linguistic things and applying them to substance. And so in a lot of ways, I think this is really not a model which is focusing, at least, you guys are having an impact on me. I was thinking in primer lugar. It's not looking at, where is this coming from? But it's not looking at imposing a set of rules or constraints or structures on this material, but rather saying we've got this material, and then the way humans approach it is by looking for remembering things, looking for particular kinds of patterns, looking for the things, and it's those things which then come out of experience with the data, which is why I would really call it more substance intensive.
Right. Okay, so.
But of course, I mean, the other thing that I think is something that's hard to disentangle at times is that we're all talking about the same things.
Yeah.
And so we're going to come up with things which often look similar, I think, if we're on this right track. But the difference here would be that we're really trying to approach this from something where we have as little linguistic baggage or machinery as we can, and then applying that to linguistic material. And so where this would say, like, where humans are special, clearly we are massively able to create generalizations from data. And compared with other species, including lots of other primates, we've developed that sort of symbolic level to a huge degree. And that's maybe what's having this impact on language, which is different than when you look at primate communication.
Okay, so your primes would be cognitive, not.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're not searching for phonological primes.
Exactly.
No. Thank you a lot.
Yeah. Succinctly said. You need to. Okay, go eat.
Pues ya. Sí, cómo no. Bueno, pues concluimos por hoy por el tiempo, no por el contenido, ¿verdad? Muchas gracias, doctor Puley Blanc. Mañana el curso seguirá en la Casa Chata a las 10 de la mañana. La Casa Chata está ubicada en, ¿me recuerdas?
La calle de Hidalgo.
Sin número.
Y sin número.
Ajá.
Y está entre Calzada de Tlalpan y otra calle que no me acuerdo cómo se llama. Como a 3 cuadras del...
De Tlalpan.
Está sobre Hidalgo. Esquina con Calzada de Tlalpan y otra.
Es literal una casa chata.
Exactamente. Entonces,
Sí.
a 3 cuadras
Bueno, pues,
del mero
ok.
centro de Tlalpan. ¿no?
Ok, pues los esperamos mañana. Gracias por estar aquí con nosotros.